My stepson dragged me to his room and put it in my face. Stepmom Infidelity story. But what would you do if a moment of vulnerability turned into a connection you couldn't ignore? A bond so intense it threatened to shatter the foundations of everything you held sacred. This is a story about boundaries blurred, choices that could never be undone, and the complicated dance between love, loyalty, and desire. What happens when emotions collide with forbidden territory? And can you truly move on after crossing the line? Before we dive into this deeply emotional and provocative story, make sure to subscribe. Over the next few days, I threw myself into household chores, desperate to occupy my mind and avoid being alone with Max. But avoiding him was easier said than done. He seemed to be everywhere, offering to help with dinner, asking about my day, and always finding a reason to linger in the same room. His presence, once comforting, now felt overwhelming. Every time our paths crossed, I felt the tension simmering just beneath the surface. One afternoon, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, I heard Max enter the room. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. His steps were deliberate, and I could feel the weight of his gaze on my back. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice light but carrying an undertone of something deeper. "No, I've got it," I replied, keeping my focus on the soapy water. I hoped the dismissive tone in my voice would deter him, but instead he came closer, standing at the counter beside me. "You've been avoiding me," he said plainly, his tone soft but direct. I froze for a moment before resuming my task. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do," he said, leaning against the counter. "And it's okay. I just want to talk." "Max, there's nothing to talk about," I said, my voice firmer now. "We both know where the lines are, and they're not to be crossed." "I'm not trying to cross any lines," he said, though the intensity in his eyes said otherwise. "I just want to understand why you're so quick to shut me out." I set the dish in my hand down with more force than I intended and turned to face him. "Because it's complicated, Max. And because this, whatever this is, can't happen." His expression softened, but he didn't back down. "I get it. I do. But you don't have to push me away completely." For a moment I said nothing, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. Finally, I sighed and turned back to the sink, hoping to end the conversation. "I think it's best if we just focus on getting through the summer. That's all." Later that evening, Max's words replayed in my mind as I sat on the couch. The house was quiet, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to relax. But the peace didn't last long. I heard Max's footsteps on the stairs, and moments later he appeared in the doorway. "Do you want to watch something?" he asked, holding up the remote. His expression was open, almost boyish, and for a second I saw the Max I'd known before everything became so complicated, and hesitated before nodding. "Sure." He sat down on the opposite end of the couch, maintaining a respectable distance. We settled on a movie, and for a while, it felt like old times. We laughed at the cheesy dialogue and shared a bowl of popcorn, the tension between us momentarily forgotten. But as the credits rolled, the weight of our unresolved emotions returned. Max shifted in his seat, turning to face me. "Can I ask you something?" I looked at him warily. "Depends on what it is." "Why do you act like this is all on me?" he asked, his tone careful but probing. "Like I'm the only one who feels Something. Max, don't, I warned, my heart pounding. This isn't a conversation we should be having. But we're already having it, he said, his voice steady. And I think you owe it to yourself to be honest. I shook my head, standing up to put some distance between us. This isn't about honesty. It's about doing what's right. He stood too, his heightened presence suddenly overwhelming. What if what feels right isn't what's supposed to be right? Max, you don't understand, I said, my voice cracking. This isn't just about us. There's Peter, there's our family, there's everything we stand to lose. I know, he said, his voice softer now. But that doesn't change how I feel. I looked at him, my resolve wavering. The intensity in his eyes was almost too much to bear. It has to change, I said finally, though even I wasn't convinced by my own words. He stepped closer, but this time I didn't back away. I just want you to know, he said quietly, that you're not alone, and I'm not going anywhere. He smiled. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. I need some air, I said, brushing past him and heading for the back porch. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped outside. I leaned against the railing, taking deep breaths to steady myself. The stars were bright, their beauty a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling inside me. I heard the door open behind me and knew without looking that it was Max. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me, his presence both comforting and unnerving. I didn't mean to upset you, he said finally. I know, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. But this is a line we can't cross, Max, no matter how we feel. He nodded, though I could see the conflict in his eyes. I don't want to make things harder for you. I needed you to know how I feel. I looked at him then, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't just some passing infatuation for him. It was real, raw, and complicated. We'll get through this, I said, more to convince myself than him. We have to. He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, we will. As we stood there in silence, the tension between us slowly gave way to a fragile understanding. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start, and for now, that had to be enough. The following morning, I awoke to the sound of rain pattering against the windows. The overcast sky mirrored my mood, a mix of unease and confusion that I couldn't shake. Max's words from the night before lingered in my mind, their weight pressing heavily on my chest. I needed to find a way to put some distance between us, both physically and emotionally, before the boundaries blurred any further. I spent the better part of the day avoiding him, keeping myself busy with cleaning and organizing closets that hadn't been touched in years. Max seemed to pick up on my need for space and stayed in his room for most of the morning. But by early afternoon, the silence in the house became suffocating. As I was folding laundry in the living room, Max walked in, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "Hey," he said casually, though there was an underlying tension in his voice. "Do you want some coffee?" I was about to make a pot. I hesitated, torn between the desire to maintain some distance and the small comfort of normalcy. "Sure," I replied finally, forcing a smile. "That sounds nice." He disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard the familiar clatter of mugs and the hiss of the coffee machine. When he returned, he handed me a steaming cup and sat down on the couch across from me. For a moment, we sipped our coffee in silence, the air between us filled with unspoken words. I've been thinking, Max began, breaking the quiet. His tone was measured, as if he'd rehearsed what he was about to say. Maybe it's best if I spend some time at a friend's place. Give us both some space. His words caught me off guard. It was the exact solution I'd been contemplating, yet hearing him suggest it made my chest tighten. "If that's what you think is best," I said, keeping my voice even. "Maybe it would be good for both of us." Max nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'll pack a bag tonight and head out tomorrow morning." I wanted to say something more, to assure him that this wasn't a rejection of him as a person, but a necessary step to maintain the fragile balance of our lives. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded and returned my focus to the laundry, hoping he couldn't see the conflict in my eyes. The following day, the house felt unnaturally quiet without Max. I told myself that his absence was for the best, that it would give me the clarity I desperately needed. But as the hours turned into days, I found myself missing his presence more than I cared to admit. The loneliness I'd felt before his arrival now seemed magnified, the empty spaces in the house echoing with memories of his laughter and the easy way he filled a room. Peter called that evening to check in, his voice as detached as ever. "How are things at home?" he asked, the sound of typing in the background suggesting he was only half listening. "Fine," I replied, forcing a cheerfulness I didn't feel. "Max went to stay with a friend for a bit. I think he wanted a change of scenery." "That's good," Peter said, his tone dismissive. "He's a grown man now. He needs his independence." I bit back the urge to tell him that independence wasn't the issue, that his absence was the reason for the fractures forming in our family. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Peter's priorities had always been elsewhere, and nothing I said would change that. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of the living room, the weight of my emotions threatening to overwhelm me. I knew I couldn't continue like this, trapped in a cycle of longing and guilt. Something had to change. A week later, Max returned. He didn't call or text to let me know he was coming. He simply walked through the door as if he had never left. I was in the kitchen when I heard the familiar sound of his footsteps, and my heart leapt despite my best efforts to remain composed. "Hey," he said, setting his bag down by the door. "I hope it's okay that I came back. My friend's place was cramped." I turned to face him, my emotions a whirlwind. "Of course it's okay," I said, though my voice betrayed my nervousness. "This is your home too." He smiled, and for a moment, everything felt normal again. But as the evening wore on, the tension between us began to creep back in. It was in the way his eyes lingered on me a moment too long, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. And despite my best efforts to ignore it, I felt the same pull toward him, the same unspoken connection that had driven us apart. The turning point came one evening when the power went out during a summer storm. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning outside. Max found a flashlight and lit a few candles, their soft glow casting flickering shadows across the walls. We sat together in the living room, the storm raging outside. The closeness of the space and the intimacy of the candlelight made it impossible to ignore the tension that had been building between us. "This reminds me of when I was a kid," Max said, breaking the silence. "Whenever there was a storm, my mom would light candles and tell me stories to keep me from getting scared." I smiled at the memory he shared, though it was tinged with sadness. Max rarely talked about his mother, who had passed away shortly before Peter and I met. "She sounds like she was a wonderful mom," I said softly. "She was," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. She had this way of making everything feel safe, no matter how bad things got. I reached out and placed a comforting hand on his arm, the gesture meant to offer reassurance. But as our eyes met, the air between us shifted. The closeness, the warmth, the shared vulnerability. It was all too much. "Max," I began, my voice trembling. "We can't." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but it doesn't stop how I feel." Before I could respond, a sudden clap of thunder shook the house, breaking the moment. I pulled my hand away and stood, putting some distance between us. "I should check on the candles," I said, my voice shaky. Max didn't try to stop me, but I could feel his eyes on me as I moved around the room. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within me, and I knew that if we didn't find a way to resolve this, it would consume us both. The next morning, I sat down with Max at the kitchen table, determined to address what had been left unsaid for too long. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm but gentle. He looked at me, his expression wary. "About what?" "About us," I said, taking a deep breath. "Max, I care about you deeply, but we can't let these feelings ruin everything. It's not fair to you, to me, or to Peter." He nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. "I know. I don't know how to turn it off." "I don't think you can," I said honestly, "but we can choose how we handle it, and I think the best thing for both of us is to set boundaries." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and acceptance. "You're right. I don't want to make things harder for you." I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll get through this, together. But we have to be strong." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks for not giving up on me." "Never," I said, my own smile breaking through the heaviness in the room. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to find a way to rebuild the trust and boundaries that had been tested. And I started to lie. The days that followed were surprisingly calm. After our conversation, Max seemed to make a conscious effort to respect the boundaries we had set. He kept himself busy, spending most of his time outside, working on projects around the house or meeting with friends. I focused on reclaiming a sense of normalcy, immersing myself in small tasks that gave me a feeling of control. Yet, even as life seemed to steady, an undercurrent of tension remained. It wasn't something we spoke about, but it lingered in the quiet moments, in the pauses between words. One afternoon, I was in the garden, pruning the rose bushes, when Max walked up, a glass of iced tea in his hand. The summer heat was relentless, and I welcomed the gesture, taking the glass from him with a grateful smile. "Thanks," I said, wiping the sweat from my brow. "It's scorching out here." "It is," he agreed, sitting down on the edge of the stone pathway. "You've been out here for hours." "I needed something to keep me busy," I admitted, taking a sip of the tea. The cool liquid was refreshing, but I couldn't ignore the way his presence made my heart race, even now. Max nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he stared at the garden. "You've always been good at keeping things in order," he said, "even when everything else feels chaotic." His words caught me off guard, and I looked at him, unsure of how to respond. There was a sincerity in his tone that made my chest tighten. "I guess it's my way of coping," I said finally, my voice softer. "We all have our ways." He didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched between us. For a moment, It felt like we were teetering on the edge of another conversation we shouldn't have, but then he smiled, the tension breaking. "You're really good at this gardening thing," he said, gesturing to the blooming flowers around us. "The roses look amazing." "Thanks," I said, grateful for the shift in focus. "It's a labor of love." As we chatted about the garden, the weight that had been pressing down on us lifted, even if only slightly. It was a reminder of what we once had, a connection built on trust and shared moments, untainted by the complications that had since crept in. That evening, Peter called to say he'd be home the following weekend. The news filled me with a mix of relief and apprehension. Having him home would provide some much-needed normalcy, but it also meant navigating the unspoken truths that had built up in his absence. When I told Max, he simply nodded, his expression neutral. "That's good," he said. "It'll be nice to have him around." I studied him carefully, trying to gauge his true feelings. "Are you okay with that?" "Yeah," he said, though his tone didn't quite match the words. "It's his house too, after all." "Himmy." His comment stung more than I expected, and I found myself wondering if he resented Peter for his long absences, for leaving us both to fend for ourselves in ways we never should have had to. "Max," I said gently, "it's okay to feel however you feel about this. You don't have to pretend." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "I just want things to be normal again," he said finally. "Whatever that means." I nodded, understanding all too well. Me too. The week passed quickly, and before I knew it, Peter was home. He arrived late Friday night, his suitcase in one hand and his phone in the other. He greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek, his focus already shifting to whatever email had just come through. Max appeared at the top of the stairs, offering his father a polite smile. "Hey, Dad," he said, his tone cordial but distant. "Max," Peter replied, giving him a brief nod. "Good to see you, son." It was a far cry from the warm reunion I'd hoped for, but I supposed it was better than outright tension. As the evening wore on, the three of us settled into an uneasy rhythm, the weight of unspoken truths hanging over us like a cloud. Over the next few days, Peter's presence in the house seemed to shift the dynamic between Max and me. With him around, there was no room for stolen glances or lingering conversations. We all played our parts, falling into the familiar roles of husband, wife, and son. But beneath the surface, I could feel the strain growing. Peter, oblivious as ever, spent most of his time in his office or on the phone, leaving Max and me to navigate the unspoken tension on our own. It came to a head one afternoon when Peter announced he'd be leaving again in a few days, this time for an extended trip overseas. Max didn't say anything, but I could see the frustration flicker across his face. As Peter left the room to take another call, Max turned to me, his voice low. "He's always gone," he said, the bitterness in his tone unmistakable. "It's like he doesn't even care." "Max, it's not that simple," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed my own words. "His work is important. And what about us?" he shot back. "Aren't we important?" I didn't have an answer for him, and the silence that followed was deafening. For all my efforts to maintain boundaries, I couldn't deny the truth in his words. Peter's absence had left a void that neither of us knew how to fill. The night before Peter left, we had a family dinner. It was meant to be a gesture of togetherness, but the tension at the table was palpable. Peter spent most of the meal discussing his upcoming trip, oblivious to the strained silence between Max and me. After dinner, Peter excused himself to pack, leaving Max and me alone in the kitchen. I began clearing the dishes, my movements mechanical as I tried to ignore the tension building between us. Sarah looked deep into my eyes. "You okay?" Max asked, his voice soft. "Yeah," I said, though I knew he didn't believe me. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine as he took a plate from my grasp. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I pulled back quickly, my heart pounding. "Max, don't," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," I said, cutting him off. Let's just finish this and call it a night." He nodded, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy between us. As we finished the dishes in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't come back from. Peter left early the next morning, his departure marked by a brief kiss on my cheek and a hurried goodbye. As his car disappeared down the driveway, I felt a familiar mix of relief and loneliness. Max appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "So it's just us again," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Yeah," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "Just us." For the first time in weeks, the house felt unbearably quiet, and as the hours stretched into days, I found myself questioning everything, my choices, my emotions, and the fragile balance we were trying so hard to maintain. The days following Peter's departure were a delicate balancing act. Max and I avoided being alone together for too long, silently acknowledging that the unspoken tension between us was still dangerously present. I focused on household tasks, while he spent most of his time out of the house, either jogging through the neighborhood or visiting friends. It was an uneasy truce, but it worked. For a while. One evening, as I was settling onto the couch with a book, Max came into the living room. He hesitated in the doorway before walking in, holding a bowl of popcorn. "Movie night?" he asked, his tone casual but his expression carefully guarded. I considered saying no, retreating to the safety of my room, but I was tired of avoiding him, tired of feeling like a stranger in my own home. "Sure," I said, setting the book aside. "What do you have in mind?" He flipped through the streaming options until we landed on an old favorite, a light-hearted comedy we'd watched together as a family years ago. It felt safe, familiar, like a bridge to a simpler time. As the movie played, we laughed at the familiar jokes, the shared nostalgia momentarily easing the tension between us. Halfway through, the power flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. The sudden silence was startling, and I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. "Hold on," Max said, getting up. Moments later, I heard him lighting a candle in the kitchen. He returned with the small flame, its flickering light casting long shadows across the room. "Some water?" "Romantic," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. He smiled faintly, sitting down on the couch again. "It's better than nothing," he thought. We sat in silence for a while, the candlelight creating an intimate glow that made the space between us feel smaller. I could feel his eyes on me, and my heart began to race. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally, his voice low. I hesitated, bracing myself. "Sure. Do you ever regret marrying my dad?" The question caught me off guard, and I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. "That's a complicated question," I said carefully. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the candle. "I just mean, you don't seem happy." "Not really." His observation cut deeper than I expected. I'd spent so long convincing myself that the cracks in my marriage were normal, that my unhappiness was just a phase. But hearing it said aloud, especially by Max, made it impossible to ignore. "It's not that simple," I said finally. "Marriage is complicated. It's not always perfect, but it's about commitment." "Commitment to what, though?" he asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "To being alone? To pretending everything's fine when it's not?" I looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "Max, you deserve more," he said, cutting me off. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a rawness that made my chest tighten. "You deserve to be with someone who sees you, who makes you feel alive." "Max, stop," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't fair." "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his expression softening. "I didn't mean to upset you." I stood abruptly, needing space to clear my head. "I think we both need some air," I said, grabbing my phone and heading for the back porch. Outside, the cool night air did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I leaned against the railing, taking deep breaths and willing myself to regain control. I couldn't keep doing this, teetering on the edge of something I couldn't undo, something that would hurt everyone involved. The door creaked open behind me and I tensed. "I thought we needed space," I said without turning around. "I know," Max said quietly, "but I hate seeing you like this." I turned to face him, my emotions spilling over. "And what do you think you're doing to me, Max? This, whatever this is, has to stop. It's not right." "I know it's not right," he said, stepping closer. "But that doesn't mean it's not real." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with truth and vulnerability. I looked away, tears stinging my eyes. "It doesn't matter," I said, my voice breaking. "We can't act on it." "We can't." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I pulled away quickly. "Max, please," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make this harder than it already is." "Ah," she chuckled. He nodded, stepping back. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't mean to make things worse." I wiped at my eyes, willing myself to regain control. "We'll figure this out," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "But we have to be stronger than this." "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice raw. "Even if it means keeping my distance, I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I said, though my heart ached with the uncertainty of my own words. "We'll find a way to move past this. We have to." He nodded again, the pain in his eyes mirroring my own. "Good night," he said softly, before turning and walking back into the house. I stayed on the porch long after he'd gone, the weight of our conversation pressing down on me. The road ahead felt impossibly difficult, but I knew one thing for certain. We couldn't continue like this. Something had to change, for both our sakes. The next few days were quieter than I had expected. Max kept his distance, and I buried myself in tasks to keep my mind from wandering. The house felt larger than ever, every empty room a reminder of the complicated web we had woven. At times, I caught myself looking toward Max's room, wondering what he was doing, but I stopped myself before I could act on the impulse. It wasn't just about avoiding him anymore. It was about preserving what little sense of normalcy we still had. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house filled with the soft hum of cicadas, I heard a knock on my bedroom door. My heart leapt into my throat, but I steadied myself before opening it. Max stood there, his expression unreadable, a book in his hand. "I thought you might like this," he said, holding it out to me. You mentioned liking this author a while back. I hesitated before taking it. Thank you, I said softly, my fingers brushing his as I accepted the book. The contact was brief, but it lingered in the air between us. I'll let you get back to your evening, he said, turning to leave. Max, I called after him, my voice stopping him in his tracks. He turned, waiting for me to continue. Thank you, I repeated, though this time my words carried more weight. It wasn't just about the book. It was about the effort he was making to respect our boundaries, to give us both the space we needed. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Good night, he said before walking down the hall. Better. The gesture, small as it was, marked a shift in our dynamic. Over the following days, we found a way to coexist without the suffocating tension that had defined our interactions for weeks. We shared meals, exchanged polite conversation, and even watched a movie together without incident. It felt like a fragile truce, one I was determined to maintain. But the undercurrent of something deeper was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. It was in the way his eyes lingered on me a moment too long, the way my heart raced whenever he entered the room. I told myself it was natural, that emotions didn't just disappear overnight. But I also knew that allowing those feelings to fester unchecked was a dangerous game. One rainy afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Max came in carrying a stack of board games. I thought maybe we could play something, he said, his tone light but his expression hopeful. I hesitated. It's been a while since I've played anything like that. All the more reason to try, he said, setting the games on the coffee table. Come on, it'll be fun. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself agreeing despite my initial reservations. We started with a simple game, something light-hearted that didn't require much strategy. As the rain pattered against the windows, we laughed at each other's mistakes, the tension between us dissolving into genuine camaraderie. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of ease in his presence. It wasn't about boundaries or unspoken emotions. It was about enjoying each other's company as we once had before everything became so complicated. But that peace was short-lived. A few days later, Peter called to say he was extending his trip indefinitely. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if the news was inconsequential. But it hit me like a punch to the gut. You understand, don't you? He said, his voice crackling over the phone. This project is huge. I can't afford to step away right now. Of course, I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. I understand. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone in my hand. I should have been used to it by now. Peter's absences were nothing new, but this time it felt different. This time, the loneliness was sharper, more pronounced. When Max found me later, I was still sitting there, lost in thought. You okay? He asked, his voice filled with concern. I looked up at him, my resolve crumbling. Peter's extending his trip, I said, my voice breaking. He's not coming home anytime soon. Max sat down beside me, his presence grounding me. I'm sorry, he said softly. That's not fair to you. It's just how it is, I said, though the bitterness in my tone betrayed me. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing a comforting hand on mine. You don't have to keep pretending you're okay, he said. It's okay to be upset. His words, simple as they were, broke through the wall I'd been holding up for so long. Tears welled in my eyes, and I didn't bother wiping them away. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself feel the weight of everything. Peter's absence, the strain of my emotions, and the fragile balance I was desperately trying to maintain. Max didn't say anything else. He simply sat there, his presence a quiet reassurance. And for a brief moment, I let myself lean into that comfort, knowing it was fleeting, but needing it all the same. In the days that followed, I tried to refocus my energy on rebuilding my sense of self. I took long walks, started a new book, and even began painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned years ago. Max continued to respect the boundaries we'd set, but there was an unspoken understanding between us that things were still fragile. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, I found him in the backyard repairing the fence. He worked methodically, his focus unwavering, and I stood in the doorway for a moment watching him. There was something grounding about his presence, something steady in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. "Need any help?" I called out, stepping onto the porch. He looked up, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I wouldn't say no," he replied with a grin. I joined him, holding the boards in place as he hammered them in. The work was simple, almost meditative, and for a while we worked in comfortable silence. When we finished, he stepped back to admire our handiwork. "Not bad," he said, his tone light. "We make a pretty good team." I smiled, the weight in my chest lifting slightly. "Yeah, we do." As we stood there, side by side, I realized that while the road ahead was still uncertain, we were finding our way. Slowly but surely, we were learning how to coexist without losing ourselves or each other in the process. As the months passed, life returned to something resembling normal. Peter's absence remained a constant, but it no longer filled me with the same resentment. I had found ways to reclaim parts of myself that had been lost through painting, gardening, and reconnecting with old friends. Yet, no matter how much time went by, Max's departure left a mark I couldn't erase. Every now and then, I'd get a call or text from him, brief updates about his classes or the new friends he'd made. He never said it outright, but I could hear the change in his voice, a mix of maturity and acceptance that hadn't been there before. It was as if the distance had given him the clarity we both needed. One evening, as I stood in the backyard watering the garden, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Max. "Just wanted to say thank you for everything. You'll always be in my heart." I stared at the screen, a bittersweet smile tugging at my lips. I typed a reply, my fingers trembling slightly. "You'll always have a place in mine too. Take care of yourself." As I hit send, a sense of peace washed over me. It wasn't closure in the traditional sense, but it was enough to know that we had both found a way to move forward. The weight of the past no longer felt like a burden, but a lesson. A reminder of the complexities of love and the strength it takes to let go. That night, as I lay in bed, the cool breeze drifting through the open window, I allowed myself one final thought of Max. I knew our story would always remain with me, tucked away in the quiet corners of my memory. But it was time to leave it there, to let life unfold in its unpredictable, imperfect way. Some chapters are meant to end, even if they leave you wondering what might have been, and in their ending, you find the strength to begin anew.